Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. This is Tullio Siragusa with Dojo Live, and this is the Design Thinking Show. Today, we're talking with our guest, Rajiv Mehta, who's the CEO at Atlas Care. Welcome to the show this morning, Rajiv. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Tullio. I'm looking forward to it.
So, what we're talking about is how companies and organizations are applying design thinking into their business, how they're creating memorable experiences for both their customers and their employees. And what does that all mean? So, we're going to go through 7 questions to try to illuminate how organizations have used design thinking to create really amazing organizations and companies that you want to be part of. So today, our guest is Rajiv Mehta. Rajiv, if you could please introduce yourself. Let's get to know you a little bit, and then we'll talk about Atlas of Care, and we'll kick off our conversation this morning or afternoon, wherever you're watching.
Great. Thanks, Tullio. What can I say? I lead a nonprofit called Atlas of Care, which I founded and I'm the CEO of. But before I got into this space, for the first sort of 25 years of my career, I was in science and technology. I started off doing basic research for NASA and then switched to kind of the other business of Silicon Valley, leading innovation at companies like Apple and Adobe and Regis McKenna, Interval Research. At the end of that, I was a fellow at Symbol Technologies. And as part of that, the only thing I suppose I should mention is I have deep interest in photography, as you can tell, this stuff behind my wall, and I can take some real credit for the start of digital cameras. So there's just a lot of innovation involved, and a lot of it is, of course, technology-based, but deeply kind of anthropological at the front end. Almost everything I worked on would be considered, radical innovation, which means most of the stuff never made it to market, but some things like digital cameras have become very popular. And then about 15, 17 years ago or so, I started thinking about and focusing all my energies on how do we people take care of ourselves, our families, our communities, with this idea that, what can be done to make our efforts both more effective, but much more joyful. And as odd as it sounds, all that past experience in NASA, Apple, et cetera, have been core to the advances I've made in that. And somehow I fell down this rabbit hole, and here I am 17 years later. And since we're on a design show, I should mention early on, so that would be 2010, I published a paper in ACM's Interactions Journal on reframing health to embrace design of our own self-being.
Amazing. Yeah. Amazing. Well, the digital camera transformed technology. I mean, it's all packed into these little phones now, but it's pretty amazing what it did. Now, quick question before we go into what Atlas of Care is about. Are those your own photography? Are those pictures you've taken yourself?
All of those are my own.
Impressive.
Yeah, different places.
Very nice. Very nice. All right. Tell us about Atlas of Care. What was that aha moment that you decided, I need to start this and create this? And what is it that you guys do today? What is your mission?
Yeah, so it began a long time ago through a long story of it. Part of the work I did before in innovation was really fundamental innovation. So constantly looking at the world with kind of, what's going on here that we're not really deeply paying attention to. The camera came about from focusing on, as odd as it sounds, why do we not take pictures when a photo would be useful? In the same way, I started paying attention to how we care for ourselves, not by what doctors say, but what were we trying to do and what got in the way of that. So, 17 years is a lot to cover in a thumbnail. So I'll just say about 15 years ago, I led some really sort of groundbreaking research on how people care for themselves. And along the way, both before and after, have spent lots of times with families in their homes. And two key findings have been that we people don't have a clear understanding of the relationships that we have and the impact of our day-to-day activities on our well-being. And secondly, that we also don't have a clear picture of the wealth of resources, knowledge, and skills around us within our family and friends. Because of this, our efforts aren't as successful. And so over the last few years, especially over the last 2 to 3 years, Atlas has been focusing on developing a program which we call Mapping Ourselves, which is focused on kind of teaching people innovative tools and methods for self-reflection. So things like meditation and so forth, a few thousand years old ways of knowing ourselves. But in the last 10, 15 years, there's actually been huge innovation in tools and methods for self-reflection. And secondly, kind of designing an experience of collective self-reflection so that through which people learn to talk with each other about care and discover how to leverage their collective capacity. And so a lot of Atlas's work these days is focused on this Mapping Ourselves program.
Amazing. Yes, self-care is definitely a hot topic in recent years, and I'm not sure many of us understand what that truly means. It's not necessarily a day at the spa, right?
Right.
So let's see what we can learn today. We're talking about fostering a community of connection and care. And the very first question is, because we're curious how what you guys have done around this. What methodologies were used to develop your mission, and why did you use those approaches?
Sure. Well, in a sense, the core mission of helping us care for ourselves effectively, more joyfully, that was just sort of fundamental to getting into this space. So that mission was just is. So the core mission is what it is, but our approach has changed over time. As I mentioned, there's lots of research, lots of experimentation we've done, which has led to changes in how we approach this. And as one very important sort of milestone along the way, about 2015, we did some groundbreaking research of finding new ways to collect data about day-to-day care in real life. It was an intense study of a few families. And one of the most surprising findings was how much the families were deeply impacted by our diagrams of their lives. They were able to see their lives more clearly, and this turned out to be really empowering. Even when our diagram showed how hard their lives were, this made them feel better that they weren't making this up. They weren't incompetent or lazy, that this really was hard. It also allowed them to see the positives in their lives and see, oh, I can take advantage of that. And also just kind of spark lots of little ideas or big ideas of what they could do differently. It also empowered them to advocate for their needs because they could present to others very clearly, here is my situation. These needs are beyond my capacity. And so it changed our focus dramatically from developing innovation for us researchers to study those families to developing tools and methods for people to study ourselves. So a big shift in direction from what you might call big science to personal science.
Amazing. Okay, so it's really like personalization at a whole nother level that we're talking about here. And how does the company foster innovation among the participants to create community? So once you've shifted that, then how are you using that to foster innovation amongst all the participants? And how is that creating community?
Yeah, so this is really basic to design. I mean, these ideas are this mindset permeates everything from the initial outreach, the first time you meet someone, to when they're participating in ongoing. So it's just a deep mindset. But to focus somewhere, I'll talk about the design of these workshops that we've been holding. And they vary from 1 hour programs to kind of what's the most common is a series of 5 weekly 90-minute Zoom sessions for a particular community. So, to mention 3 things that we do to foster innovation amongst the participants. One is that when we're teaching these tools, we stress that they are meant to be flexible. They are meant to be tailored by you for your needs. They're your tools. And so we just encourage them to not follow our rules, if that makes sense. We encourage them to create their own. And we show lots of examples of how other people in the past have created their own. Secondly, we try to give them confidence in their own instincts, confidence in their own perceptions, confidence in their own abilities to understand and lead their lives. And thirdly, and really importantly, is the program stresses a lot of conversation amongst the participants. And honestly, that's where all the magic happens. And so we're trying to give them an experience of talking to community, which then hopefully simply continues into their normal lives. And we've seen that, in fact, it works pretty well. So we're sparking innovation that hopefully then simply continues.
It's amazing. In the business world, that's mostly accomplished, at least in recent years, through mastermind initiatives, right? You have executives getting together, users getting together and talking through how to solve different challenges. But what I'm hearing though is, do you think this could be valuable even to non for profit companies, whereas they can create a sense of community and innovation amongst clients, for example? Do you think that's a possibility? Is that something that maybe for profit companies are missing out on based on your experience of what you're doing at Atlas?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have developed a society where we prize expertise, and not to criticize it. I mean, being a scientist myself, I have some sense of that. But in the process, we have taught us to devalue our own knowledge and skills. And so, what we're trying to do through this idea of personal science and giving people real examples and real tools to get that started is to discover how capable they are, especially when they work collectively. So, it's not to ignore the advice of experts, but to build your own, to really take advantage of your own assets. And that's universal. So, honestly, just a couple of days ago, I was talking with a second grade teacher in LA who's using these ideas with her second graders. So 8-year-olds. We're working with a
Wow.
lot of high schools right now, but we've also worked with corporate execs and, all sorts of social activists and so forth. This is a human thing, not limited to any particular type of organization.
So, Rajiv, to be effective at this, I think we'll agree you need to get participation, right? So, what does the company do in terms of designing processes in support of encouraging participation? What are you guys been doing that's working?
Um, well, one of the most important things at the front end, especially since we're talking about well-being and care that people are unaccustomed to talking with each other about, is really creating a safe space in our programs to do that. One of the things we stress is this idea we call rules for gentle listening, which are kind of obvious, but people like hearing them. We advise them not to be solving other people's problems during these programs, to not criticize or even really to praise, but really to listen, to understand. And likewise, from the speaking side, to really speak for yourself, share your own observations, your own perceptions, your own feelings, which are yours. You can't disagree with those, rather than sort of pontificating for everyone. And we try to model that ourselves in the sense that we listen deeply to the comments and we try to respond with kind of openness and empathy and generosity without kind of abdicating our expertise. And that's always a balancing act. You never get it right. You're always screwing up in one way or the other, but that's the spirit you try to do. And that's kind of allowing innovation to happen, both by modeling and encouraging it.
I'm very encouraged by what you're saying. I resonates with me personally. I've always been desirous of being of service, and sometimes I come across as the guy pontificating, right? Because you're trying to be of service. Whereas in recent years, especially with my work with design thinking and adapting empathy as a key skill to design thinking, I've learned to be more curious. So curiosity sometimes needs to trump the need to be of service. That's probably a good way to be of service as well as listening to people. So
Yeah.
thanks for sharing that with us. So let's shift to the next question. How does the company put people's needs as the focal point of the mission? You've mentioned a little bit about this, but I'm curious to see how you got there. What
Yeah.
did you guys do to understand those needs and put them as the focal point of your mission?
Yeah, it really begins almost like anthropology. It's deep observation, deep listening. To just give an example from a different universe, as I said, in the world of digital photography, the spark came from paying attention to when do people not take photos. This is back in the 80s. And things we might take for granted now, taking photos of whiteboards or where you park the car at the airport, were things we didn't do at the time, even though the picture would have been useful. It was because film was completely inappropriate for the job, which kind of opened the door. Oh, there's a space that digital photography is simply necessary. So in the same way, we're paying attention to the world. And in that sense, you can't ask people what they want and assume that's the answer. You can't abdicate your expertise, your responsibility to make judgments. So our job is to look more deeply, to think more deeply. And for example, these tools that I mentioned, they're all paper and pencil tools for collecting data, visualizing data, and so forth. And in the modern world, everybody, from the high school teacher to all the tech execs say, there are these things called apps. And it's like, okay, yes, I've built lots of products for Apple, Adobe, et cetera. I know about the technology. We have chosen pencil and paper because, in fact, it's the right technology for the job at hand. There are deep needs for this. And so there's an example where we simply did what people asked. The solution will be very different than what we've come up with. So you have to listen, but not abdicate your responsibility to make decisions. The other thing about putting people's needs at the focal point is at the human level. I have to kind of pay attention to the commonalities and differences amongst people. So we've had programs with white corporate execs. We've had program with Latinx women in low-paying jobs. We've worked with teenagers and octogenarians. And there's a lot of thinking into how might we tailor this for each community. And what we've learned on the whole is that on the one hand, people are people, which means they vary a lot. And so there is diversity across those groups I mentioned, but oftentimes the diversity within the groups dwarfs these generalizations. And so in general, we find ourselves doing more or less the same thing with usually small tweaks to our program to accommodate the audience.
Amazing. So, there's people involved in everything that we do, right? So I'm curious about what have been some of the lessons learned in aligning to people's needs, which is something clearly you guys have gotten really good at. But also, there's this thing called competitors. There's other people offering similar services, similar capabilities. So, how does that get balanced out, in your opinion? How do you differentiate yourself while staying true to the needs of the people that you've learned from?
Right. Well, to state, as is the usual situation for any radical innovation, there's no direct competitors. What you're dealing with is lots of alternatives and mindsets rather than direct competitors. There are alternatives. If we're dealing with a real problem, people are trying to address it in some fashion and means. And so there are lots and lots of ideas for well-being and community that are very complementary. Just to highlight a couple, there's mindfulness classes, and then there's therapists and so forth. Mm. And so what we really have to show is really build upon this interest that is, and explain to people how our program is different, better, and actually complementary. It turns out that many people have found that what we're talking about is foundational, seeing yourself more clearly, seeing the assets in your community more clearly, that then allows you to choose wisely amongst the other alternatives and to learn and practice other ideas. Our biggest competition really is inertia, fed by two mindsets, two myths that we've been led to believe. One is that you are weak, you're ignorant, you need expert advice. There's the whole thing about don't do anything, talk to your doctor first. And so we're led to believe that the thing to do is provide people expert services and expert directions, rather than empowering people to do better at whatever they choose to do themselves. The other myth is this focus on the individual, that you can do better by changing you. And so whether it's therapy or everything else, it's all directed to you. But our lives are so complex. We're social beings. We interact so much, and the world makes an impact on us. And so we really need to take a much more systems approach to these things, which is complicated. It doesn't lend itself to expert services, but it is very powerful when we're dealing with your own life. And so our overcoming these myths is kind of the starting challenge. It's like, oh, I never thought of doing that. The other thing to mention is, if you think of what we're doing with the famous technology adoption cycle, we're pretty much at the early tail. And so, we're looking for early adopters. We're looking for customers, collaborators who are well aware of kind of the dire state of connection and well-being in their organizations. They're able to see and acknowledge that doing more of the same or slight improvements just isn't good enough, and have the courage and authority to try something new. So we're really looking for the early adopters who, by their nature, are kind of really open to alternatives.
Yeah, that's a lot of companies can take that to heart as well. We had a guest on Dojo Live. I think it was the first guest of the year, if I don't remember correctly. Kintone, and they were talking about 100 different processes for 100 different people. They've adopted this mindset that it's not about pushing conformity; it's about empowering people to do things in their own way. And so what I'm hearing is that coming from you is the power of doing that. Sometimes you can go into something with the idea of wanting to be of service, wanting to help people, and we have a preconceived notion of what that looks like. But what I'm hearing from you is people can solve their own problems if they're given the tools and the empowerment and the whereabouts to believe in themselves and the ability to do that. So thanks for sharing that with us. We're coming up with the final questions. What lessons has the company learned in the process of creating a mission-driven culture? You guys have a very mission-driven culture. It's clear in everything you've shared with us. But what are some of the lessons your company or yourself have learned from that?
Well, it's kind of to state the obvious. It's really, really hard to drive sort of foundational systemic change. So you just need a lot of tenacity to be able to kind of stay in the game while plagued with challenges and self-doubts and so forth. So you need friends to support through, especially support your spirit through the ups and downs. And to add to that, for us, company is really an extended team of like-minded innovators. And so, themselves and other companies in other countries, each pursuing their own efforts, but united in spirit and constantly helping each other out. And so that, this whole idea of constant exploration and sort of staying optimistic has been key to this. It's a long haul. You need that internal energy to keep going.
Yeah, well, the acknowledgement of it's hard is in itself very powerful, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's going into it with your eyes wide open as to what you're working on. Final question: if you had to do it all over, Rajiv, what would you do more of?
Well, I tell you, when you had told me that was going to be one of the questions, it really stumped me because it's like the obvious answer. Well, it would be helpful if I had been smarter, if I had been more successful in raising funding or in choosing the right direction at each point in time. Let's go back, just do it differently. Obviously, that's not sort of actionable advice. There's of course been tons and tons of learning
Well,
along the
well,
way.
Rajiv, people always ask, "What would you do differently?" But I'm curious to know what would you do more of, right?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
because no one asks
Um,
that question.
I mean, just think about here's someone from the technology world who's been through a lifetime advancing technology, promoting pencil and paper tools. It's like you just got to be open to change. It's like learn as you go, change your mind. And honestly, to where you kind of led into this question, if you had told me 17 years ago that it's going to be this hard, do you really want to do this? I would have answered, are you kidding? Of course not. What sort of nutcase would do that? But that's not how it works, right? It's more you go forward and you proceed with optimism. You persevere because you believe the mission is important and that you're capable of having an impact and that you're at least roughly on the right path. Any of us that are doing things that are way outside the mainstream, that's core to it. Otherwise, honestly, there's better ways to make a living.
I hear you need to have a lot of grit and apply a lot of grit every day. That's what I hear. Okay. Well, Rajiv, it's been great to have you. We're up on time. It's been great to have you, learning from you. It's an amazing lesson in aligning to people's needs and people's values and listening and being curious and empathetically hearing and feeling what people need based on their own terms, not what we think that they need. So that's the clear message that I've heard today. Thanks for sharing that with us. And please come back at 12 o'clock Pacific today for another Dojo Live show. Until then, stay safe and have fun.
All right. Thanks for having me, Tullio. Much appreciated.